patrons, welcome back to another part in this tutorial series. And so in this part we're going to be focusing on getting the body in and also working on doing the ear as well. And then in the final part we're going to be working on the hair and the flower headband. But anyway, let's get started on the body. And so the first thing that I want to do is block in some shading for where the shadows are. So I'm going to go in with the colour French Grey. And I'm going to put this in a pencil extender, and I'm just going to very lightly shade this over the shadowed areas, which are mainly the creases in the neck. And I'm very lightly shading this. I put it in a pencil extender not because it was really short, but simply because I would be able to have less pressure directly on the pencil and I can control it a bit more. I can get more control over the pencil. Bit of shading under the chin here. Some darker shading. Easing off the pressure as I get towards those lighter areas so that it's a nice transition between the dark shading and the lighter shading. I want it to be a really soft transition, so I want to really fade it out as I get to the lighter areas of the shadow. So this shadow does extend quite far along the shoulder, but I'm easing off the pressure because it's more like a green sort of shadow, so I'm going to layer a bit of raw umber more across this area, whereas right in this darker part of the shadow it's a bit more grey toned. Also there's a bit of a shadow on this crease, but it's not as dark, so I'm not going to put as much grey shading on here, just a nice light layer. Looking around, seeing if there's anywhere else that I want to apply this pencil. A little bit on the shoulder here, and also a little bit under the chin. Just a light layer. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to layer some of the raw umber 10%. So this will be in quite a few different places because this is the lighter raw umber. And then we'll go and add the raw umber 50% for those shadowed areas. So this is going to go across more of the shadow and mid-tone areas that have this sort of green grey underbase. Just want to erase this little contour sketch line so that the sketch line doesn't show through. There's some creases in the neck as well, just really subtle ones, but I want to just get them in. So I'm adding more of that raw umber between these two creases. Layer a bit on this shoulder. I just want to use that eraser again to get rid of the sketch line. This whole area, especially these arms, are very light, especially on the left hand side. So the left hand side doesn't need too much shading. Add some of this onto this arm and shoulder. Just use this colour to get in all of these shadows, where all of the shadows are. Keep erasing any of those sketch lines, especially in these areas that are going to be staying quite light, because even the lightest sketch outline is going to show through, and you don't want to see all of your like contour sketch lines show through. So I think I'm about done with that one. Just add a little bit down here. So now I want to go in and work on the shadows a bit more with the brown ochre 50%. So I'm just using this brown ochre 50%, going over these shadows, keeping it nice and light. Going over these more yellow, sort of golden saturated areas. So as this is quite a strong colour, I won't be adding it in lots of the places, just in the darkest areas. Add this over this more subtle crease as well. Okay, that's about all I'm doing with this pencil. Now I want to go in with the burnt sienna 10%. So let's go and add a light layer everywhere with this pencil. Just shade it horizontally, keep it nice and smooth with the shading. Just want a very light layer of this. Now I'm gonna add some more layers of this shading on the darker areas or the more sort of pinky toned areas. I just want to build up some of the shading. I'm going over the shadows that I previously went over with the brown ochre 50%. There we go. Also going to add it over on this side as well. This side is a bit darker, so we can get away with adding a darker layer, especially kind of on the top of the shoulder. It does get lighter on the bottom sort of left hand side, but we can get away with adding some dark shading down here. There we go. And next I'm going to be adding the burnt ochre 10% as well, layer of that, like we did with the skin up here, just a very similar sort of process. Let's add a dark layer of this down here as well. Going up here. And so now let's go in with that burnt ochre 10%. Let's lightly add that over the whole area, very lightly, using horizontal direction and slightly diagonal on this shoulder. We're applying more of a darker layer on these shadowed areas. Apply the burnt ochre 10% here now. I'm adding a much heavier application because this is a lot more shadowed. Like before, we'll be blending all of this out using the Buff Titanium and also the white coloured pencil. And the shadowed areas we'll be blending out using some of the darker shades. Having the shading down on this crease and also on this side of the neck. Add a heavier application to this crease and to the shadow up here and just below the ear. So now I want to go in with the burnt ochre 50%. Use that on some of these darker areas, use it on the crease just to get that in and go over the grey that we added to this crease. And I'm also going to use it with a heavier application on this more shadowed area. Pretty much blending out this area with this pencil. So make sure you've got some of this darker pencil on all of the darkest shadows. Okay. Add in the dark shading under the ear and to the side. I'm going to add some of the raw umber 50% just over this shoulder part here, very lightly, just a very light layer. And also a bit more on that crease and under the ear. I want to add a layer of sepia as well for this shadow. Add the sepia over here. I'm going to put it in a pencil extender so that I can do some light shading. So put it in a pencil extender and then you can do some light shading in the other areas, like under the ear. And the shadow over here. Add a bit more shading onto the shoulder because there's quite a lot of shadow on this top part of this shoulder. I also want to go in again with the burnt sienna 10% and just add a slightly heavier layer on this shoulder. If you've gone too dark in a certain area, just go in with an eraser and lift it up. It's quite easy to lift eraser up, lift the colour pencil up, sorry. And now I'm going to go in again with the burnt ochre 10%, add a heavier application to some of these areas, not completely burnish it, but just build up the layers to give the body some sort of depth to it. Don't want it all looking flat. And I'm also going to use this to blend out this shadowed area to make that smooth. There we go, blend against the direction that the pencil strokes were put in. Helps you get it nice and smooth. Do a bit of the white. So now I'm going to blend it out with the buff titanium and also the white as well. But first let's blend it out with the buff titanium. And let's blend out all of these areas apart from the brightest sort of highlighted areas. So have a nice sharp pencil and just go in circular motions, apply a lot of pressure, and really just burnish all of these colours together. If you have got any stubborn pencil strokes, apply a lot more pressure and go in the opposite direction than what that pencil stroke was placed in, to really try and minimize the look of that stubborn pencil stroke. There we go. So as you can see, I'm leaving the center bit of the shoulder unblended so that we can blend that out with the white, otherwise it won't have enough depth if I just use the buff titanium to blend it. So we'll leave that little bit. Let's blend out between the creases now, and this area down here. We'll leave a little bit free in the middle of the neck because that's one of the highlights. So even though this colour is quite light, it's still darker than the white, and you'll still see a big difference between the colours if you blended it with the buff titanium compared to if you blended it out with the white. So that's why it's good to switch between them, to blend but use the white for the highlights, because you will see a difference. Be as light as you can while still being able to blend the areas together. Blend all this out. Don't blend the darkest shadows with this because we'll blend them with a darker colour, otherwise it's just going to get too light. We want to avoid it getting too light. But blend everywhere else, all the mid-toned areas, but just avoid the highlights and the darkest shadowed areas. I'm going to use the white now to blend out some of these highlighted areas. So against that pencil. It's one of the key things to get that smooth result, is to go against the pencil strokes the direction that the first ones were initially placed in. So everything's becoming nicely blended now. Then we can make the final adjustments. Really press down to get those brightest highlights. Okay, now we've got that all blended apart from the shadowed areas. They're pretty much blended, but I'm going to go in with the burnt ochre 50% and just go over them once more, just soften everything out and blend it into these other areas. There we go. Add a bit of burnt sienna 10%. I'm going to go in with the sepia to darken up the shadows again, darken up these creases. Going to add the sepia as well to this crease. Go over it with the burnt sienna 10%. I'm applying a bit more of this burnt sienna 10% for some more of the shadowed areas, just darken them up a bit. Fade out this shadow a bit better. Blend it with that white again. Add some of the white higher up into the shadowed area. Add a bit of the brown ochre over the crease and onto these darker shadowed areas. Now I'm going to add a bit of raw umber on some of these darker shadows to transition them into those lighter areas around them. Just glaze in this colour using the side of the pencil. Add a little bit of violet grey and the burnt sienna 10%. Blending between these shadows across it with the burnt ochre 10% as well. Just trying to soften out this sort of transition while still being able to see that it's a change from the face to the neck. At the moment I'm just trying to soften out those skin tones so there's not so many different changes in colour. So add a bit of this down here to some of the shadowed parts of the shoulder and across where this crease is. Have the burnt ochre 10% on this side. Adding the brown ochre 50% as well to this crease, over this crease, and up towards the ear for the shadows on that, just below the ear. Glazing a bit of this brown ochre just on the edge of the face. There we go, defining the edge of the face a bit better. Add some of this brown ochre 50%, glaze that under the neck. Add a bit of the burnt ochre. Glaze over it with a bit of the raw umber 10% to soften it up, lighten it up. I want to add a bit of burnt sienna in the centre of this shadow. So it's not such a grey looking shadow, I want it to be a bit more red toned. Same on this crease here, just very lightly add a bit of that burnt sienna, blend over it with the burnt ochre 10% to tone it down. Go over that crease. Again, I just want to lighten them out by going over it with the white, especially towards the ends of the crease where it's a bit more shallow, not as deep. Glaze over it with the burnt ochre. Go over this section with the burnt ochre as well. I want to add some more of the burnt sienna at 10%, just under the shadow on the arm, on the shoulder, there's a bit more of a shadow there. And also under this ear. Add a bit more burnt sienna 10% across here, just for this shadow. And towards the central part there. I want to add a bit more of a heavy application to the right hand side of the shoulder, because this side is meant to be the more shadowed, darker shoulder. Blend the edges out with the white pencil. Blend it all out. get rid of all of the little bits with the brush so that we can see it clearly, see if we need to change anything, see if anything needs to be adjusted. Just going to shape the shoulder a bit better using the raw umber 10%. Now I want to add the white to soften that out. Just glazing some of this burnt ochre 50% in just some of the shadowed areas. This shadow and this shadow needs to go darker. So let's do that now. Sometimes you'll just notice things that you need to change. So let's add a bit of the burnt sienna. Just under that, yeah. And a bit on this side. And just add a bit more to the darkest points on that crease. There we go. And now we can soften them out with the burnt sienna 10%. I'm going to go in with the burnt ochre 50% and glaze that over these areas as well. But that's it for the body for now. Let's get started on the ear. Just wipe away all these bits. Okay, so let's get started on the ear, and the first thing that I want to do is get in some of these darkest areas, so the darkest sort of shadows, and I'm going to start off using the burnt ochre to do this. So I'm just very lightly going to shade in some of these darker creases. Make sure your pencil is nice and sharp. So try to identify the darkest areas. And then look at what sort of tone they are. Are they more yellow toned, pink toned, or orange toned? Or are they more green toned? That would be like the raw umbers. More brown toned, you could add to the sepia. If they're like a grey tone shadow, then you can use like the French greys. I'm going to apply a bit more pressure just to the darkest points. So now I want to add some of the burnt sienna 10% to these more pink areas. So this area is definitely more pink toned. So I'm going to add a layer of this and overlap it onto some of those shadowed areas. And then the pink kind of stops when it gets to this more, this sort of protruding, what's the word? I don't know, this bit's more like a hole and this one's coming out a bit. Just lost the phrases. They'll come. This one's lighter. So it's just going to be pretty much buff titanium on that. As you can see, I'm leaving a few little holes for where the highlights are. And I will be adding a bit of the burnt sienna, but first I want to build up some of these darker layers and then I can just glaze over a bit of burnt sienna 10% over that at the end. Like now, just glaze a bit over so you can still see where those highlights are going to be. Add a bit of pink in here. Okay, now I'm going to go over all of the areas apart from the really highlighted ones with the burnt ochre 10%. Add a little bit of this burnt ochre 10% onto this area, but not towards the middle where that is the lightest part. We don't want to get too much on there. I'm applying a bit more pressure to these darker parts of the ear. And I'm going to go in with the burnt ochre 50%. Blend in between that with the burnt sienna 10%. And then finally blend with a bit of the white in the middle. go over it with a bit of burnt ochre. So I'm going to add a bit more of the burnt ochre 10% just on top of this part. It's a bit more of a heavy application. And then we can blend this part out with the buff titanium and the white. Add a bit more of a heavy application of the burnt ochre here. I'm going to blend inside the ear with the burnt sienna 10%. And also the white pencil. Now I'm going to add some more of that burnt ochre. This is one of the most shadowed areas. I'm going to add some burnt sienna as well to this area, just to darken that bit of the part a bit, and then blend it out again with the burnt ochre. So now I'm going to blend the rest out with the buff titanium. Make sure it's nice and sharp. Make sure you've wiped away all of the little bits. Gonna add some of the raw umber 10%. Trying to merge these two areas of skin together. And I'm also going to add some burnt sienna, 10%. Blend that with the buff titanium. Add in a bit more pressure for the highlights. Gonna add some of the burnt ochre 50%. Just working on adding some of these shadows. Just adding a bit more burnt sienna 10%. Gonna add the burnt ochre. Press a bit harder to really get the colours looking nice and rich. Now I'm going to go in with a bit of the brown ochre 50%. blend out the brown ochre a bit. Don't have to blend out all of the areas if it looks nice and smooth anyway, but if you do want to smooth it out, then just blend it out with the buff titanium. Gonna add a bit of brown ochre 50% just here as well. Add a tiny bit of the anthraquinoid pink. And just adding some shadow above the ear as well. Most of this is going to be covered by hair though. So now I'm going to go in with a white pencil and use this on the brightest highlights to really make them stand out. So now that we've got everything basically blocked in, I'm just going to look for any areas that I want to just adjust with the ear. Just want to adjust this shadow. Gonna add some of the burnt ochre 50% up into this area and blend it with the burnt ochre 10%, and finally the buff titanium. Add a bit of the white as well. I want to add some more of the brown ochre 50%. So now I'm going to go in with the burnt sienna and work on adding some more of these shadows. Just really darken up some of the shadows, the darkest parts. I'm going to blend those shadows with some burnt ochre 50%. But anyway, that's it for the ear for now. If we need to tweak anything as we go, then we can do that. We'll just smudge out this crease and this crease. So yeah, anyway guys, thank you for watching. In the next part we're going to finish this off by working on the hair and the headband. So anyway guys, I will see you in the next part. Bye everyone.